Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Stejskal, joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host, Paul Tenorio. Paul, we are here to talk about our podcast From Couva to Qatar, Remaking the United States men's national team. The U.S. will, of course, be kicking off the World Cup in Qatar on November 21st against Wales. Paul, we did a deep dive, 5-episode series looking at this team and its journey from failing to qualify for the 2018 World Cup all the way to where they are now on the brink of starting the 2022 tournament. People can listen to the podcast on the Athletic Soccer Show feed, but Paul, let's pull back the curtain a little bit. Let's go a little bit behind the scenes with folks about the making of the show. I'm going to start. What surprised you most while we were reporting out this podcast?
I think it's an interesting question. I don't know if surprise is the right word, but maybe the thing that stood out to me most from the interviews we did, there were a couple moments, and I'll pick one towards the end of the reporting. Sam, actually, you were the one who went out to the Brooklyn Bridge for the CBS event that was there around.
Stealing my moment.
I'm stealing your moment here because I know what your surprise moment is, so I didn't want to steal that one, so I'll steal this one instead. But we weren't sure what we were going to hear from the people that we interviewed, and certainly we had no way to anticipate what Clint Dempsey was going to say. But we knew we wanted Clint's voice in this podcast, and especially when it came to the episodes about the golden generation and the expectations around this team. We certainly had our opinions, but we wanted to know, what did DeMarcus Beasley think? What did Clint Dempsey think? Guys who had been through it before. And somebody asked Clint Dempsey and a couple other U.S. players whether they believed this was the best USMNT of all time. And it was kind of a perfect question for what we were discussing in the podcast, because there is such huge hype around this team, despite the fact that they're so young. And, the other two players, Mo Adu and Charlie Davies, were answering. And, you've told me that Clint was itching to go. You could see that he was ready to answer. And, basically what he said was it's disrespectful to say that about a team that is so young, that has so much more still to accomplish, that hasn't played in a World Cup yet. And, I think that surprise, again, is the wrong word, but I think it certainly showed that, what we felt, which is that people were getting a little bit too excited too early about this team, maybe is how some of the players feel as well, that there's still a lot for these young guys to prove, and that Qatar is going to be a really big and important step, and that this team has probably the highest ceiling of any team, but that there's a difference between the highest ceiling and the best team ever. How about you? Was there an interview or something that stood out to you?
Yeah, I think our interview with Greg Berhalter at Soccer House in Chicago, when he was talking about losing a friendly to Mexico in 2019 on the heels of losing the Gold Cup to Mexico and falling 3-0 at MetLife Stadium in a pretty dreadful performance, talking about how he thought he was going to lose the players and they were going to stop believing in what he was trying to do if he didn't change. And so he had to change. We saw him tweak the tactics a bit after that match to mostly good effect. But I think that level of honesty, it was a little bit surprising. I remember when he said it, Paul, we were sitting at a conference table in this old prairie style mansion in the South Loop. And we both kind of raised eyebrows. We may have even looked at each other being like, okay, that's going to be in the show. So that was one that really stood out for me. Was there anything that we didn't include that hit the cutting room floor that maybe you, in hindsight, were wishing made it into the show?
I think my favorite episode of the whole series was episode 3, where we chronicled games and moments that I think formed the identity of this team, who they were, how they came together, what they learned together. And so for me, what was hard to cut out were some of the details we got from the locker room at halftime against Honduras. We have a great anecdote from Tyler Adams, but that means that we didn't have time to use the audio from other guys who were in the locker room, or, what it was like playing Mexico at home or at the Azteca. We have all these details from these players talking about what those moments were like, and to not be able to include them all just because we were going through so many different games, so many different moments, that was really, really tough. Sam, I wonder for you though, was there someone that maybe you enjoyed talking to most out of all the different people we talked to for the pod?
I hate to dip back to the well too often with Berhalter and Dempsey, but they were really enjoyable. The interview with Walker Zimmerman was actually pretty fun. he was posted up right outside Nashville SC's training facility. I think the weather was miserable, both where you live in Chicago and where I live in New York. And Zimmerman's out here. It's like, he's like, yeah, it's like 75 degrees. The birds were literally chirping in the background. But he told some good stories, particularly about being down in El Salvador. You did the Tyler Adams interview. I listened to it, of course. That sounded awesome. The Berhalter one was fun. The Clint Dempsey one, I thought, well, there were actually a couple. The one that you referenced earlier, where I was out at Brooklyn Bridge Park and speaking to him at a CBS Sports Fan Fest for their Champions League broadcasts. But there was another one. Neither of us did it. Our colleague Chris Kamrani did it. He tracked down Dempsey, spoke to him over the phone while Clint was raking leaves outside of his house in North Carolina, which just, I don't know, it feels appropriate for those of us that know Clint Dempsey's story and kind of his shyness with the media or his lack of giving enough. But it just felt authentic and real. So I thought that was pretty cool. But yeah, I think those were some of the highlights, but I think my favorite was probably Berhalter, and just kind of hearing him be open and honest and frank in some ways, a little more guarded and strategic in others. But we got to sit with him for a full hour and really pick his brain on his entire life cycle in the U.S. job. And a lot of those answers, of course, made it into the series. So that was fun, and I think people will find it illuminating. Paul, I'm going to ask you this question, but I think you're going to bounce it right back to me. What was it like to relive some of the environments during qualifying, particularly those on the road through the making of this podcast?
Yeah, it was hard for me because I wasn't in El Salvador. Unfortunately, my daughter had a close contact with COVID, which means I was sort of a close contact. So at the time, COVID was raging in a way, and we had to test negative to get back into the U.S. It wasn't worth the risk of going. So I stayed in my hotel room in Nashville for a few extra days. You went to El Salvador and you came back and you told me it was the best environment you had ever experienced. And that would hold true over the entire course of qualifying.
Correct.
And we talk about it in the pod. It's my favorite, probably my favorite 3 minutes of the whole pod, Sam. Tell me a little bit about it. But, you know, it was a tough listen for me. It hurt my heart all over again.
Yeah, so I'm just going to set the scene, and I really do encourage you guys to go listen to the podcast, at least if for nothing else than these 3 minutes. But we go down to El Salvador. It's the first match of qualifying. There's all this attention, all this hype. No one really knows what it's going to be like. El Salvador hasn't been in the final round of CONCACAF qualifying in a decade. We're told that it's going to be like 50 to 60% capacity at Estadio Cuscatlán. It's 100% full. People are spilling into the aisles. It's that full. Gates opened, I think, 8 hours prior to kickoff. The stadium was completely packed a full 2 hours before the game began. It was a big party. They're playing music. It was this tinny loudspeaker. It was terrible sound quality. But it was a great, great vibe. Everybody was having a good time. And the U.S., I remember them coming out, and some of the guys are just kind of looking around being like, oh, crap. We didn't know what we were in for here. Walker Zimmerman talked about that in an interview with him. He said he just came out onto the field and started laughing because he was like, what is going on? This is incredible. So that was really enjoyable to be a part of. The national anthem in that game, I will never forget it for the rest of my life. I get goosebumps talking about it more than a year later now. 50,000 Salvadorans singing their hearts out for their national anthem. Really, really cool moment. Yeah, it was a great environment. The game itself was pretty forgettable. It was a 0-0 draw. Not really a lot happened, but the atmosphere was the opposite. Totally unforgettable. So that was a really cool thing to go back and relive and talk to some of the players about too, because they felt sort of similarly, at least looking back, of like, yeah, that was pretty special. Paul, let's talk about the target audience for this podcast. Who was it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting because I think this podcast is built for kind of everyone. In my mind, like a lot of this podcast is about, you know, the World Cup is so special and everyone is going to tune in around the world. So many people are going to be watching. And for us as soccer writers in the US, like it's a special thing because everyone in our country, more people than we're used to, are suddenly paying attention to our little niche corner of the sports world. And so I wanted this podcast to give those fans, the casual sports fans, a chance to say, oh man, the World Cup is starting in 3 weeks. I want to know about this US team. And right now, I think most fans know the U.S. didn't make it to the World Cup in 2018. Like sports fans, that's how they think about this men's national team. And so I wanted this podcast to provide kind of a Cliff's Notes version of, what happened there and what is it about this team that you need to know before they take the field in those 3 games in the group stage in Qatar. But for us and for many of the fans who listen to our other podcasts or have followed our coverage, there was a lot of stuff that we experienced over the last 5 years or even just 3 years under Greg Berhalter, 3+ years under Greg Berhalter, that we could only go into so much depth about, or that was something that we really wanted to express more through the people who lived it. And so I think this podcast has a lot to offer the diehard fans, a lot of those cool moments that we talked about, like you were just saying in El Salvador, opinions of guys like Beasley and Dempsey about kind of really detailed nitty-gritty things about this national team and specific players. Hearing Greg Berhalter be as honest as he was with us about his whole experience coaching the national team, looking back on his playing days and how this team compares to the 2002 team that he was on that made a run to the quarterfinal. So I think there's a lot for the diehard soccer fans. But I also think it would be really, really cool and really important for people who, are going to tune into the World Cup and watch the U.S. team for the first time, maybe since 2014 in Brazil, or, since they saw Taylor Twellman's rant on SportsCenter back in 2017, that it gives them a good idea of who this team is and why they matter and what to expect in Qatar.
Paul, I wanted this show to be accessible and informative and engaging for the people that went to every single qualifier, the dozen or so U.S. fans that did it, and also for my mom, who consumes soccer only through my podcasts. So I think we achieved that, but you'll have to listen and be the judge.
Yeah, I mean, Sam, on that note, I wonder, we told a lot about this team. We talked a lot about this team through 5 episodes. If there was a 6th episode, what do you think it would be? What did we leave out that maybe we could have dove into more?
The 6th episode, I think, would be future gazing, specifically to 2026, when the U.S. co-hosts the World Cup with Mexico and with Canada. Because for as important and for as transformational as the 2022 World Cup will be for this program and for the individuals associated with it, right? Lives are going to change based on what happens in Qatar for the U.S. team and for every team that participates in the tournament. There's still 2026 on the horizon. And this is going to be the youngest team at the 22 World Cup, which means that the bulk of the core of the players, Christian Pulisic, Weston McKennie, Tyler Adams, Brendan Aronson, so on and so forth, are going to be right in the middle of their primes when 2026 rolls around. We know about the importance of a home World Cup and how it can boost host nations. Add that to the fact that this potential golden generation is going to be playing, theoretically anyway, the best soccer of their lives at that particular moment in time. And it's not just transformational, this 2022 World Cup, but it's transitional too. They're still going through this transition. And so I think we talked about that a little bit in the show for sure. But I think if there was a 6th episode, that would sort of be the focus.
Yeah. And I think also not just about this team, which, like, you're right. We did hit on a little bit about why we should view 2022 through a bit of a lens towards 2026, but also what that World Cup at home will mean for the sport, the opportunity that it'll present for MLS, for youth development, for the continued pathway that we talk about in episode 2 that's opened between the U.S. and European leagues. Like there is a huge impact of hosting a World Cup. In 1994, it launched MLS. So, the idea that 2026 could be a springboard is a big one. And I think for sure would be worth, a 30-minute episode just diving into kind of the value for the sport in general in this country. But that'll be for a podcast for another day, Sam.
Yeah, the one we do after the U.S. wins the World Cup in 22, right?
Exactly.